In February of 2015, the Order 1886 came and went. This third-person, narrative-driven action game arrived on PlayStation 4 with the backing of Sony and plenty of hype behind it. Yet when the dust settled, we were left with what felt like a prologue for a larger concept and a Metacritic score of just 63. The game certainly has its fans, but it was largely forgotten, and its developer went on to explore the VR space instead. So why then are we talking about the Order 1886 in 2023? Well, it turns out, reflecting on it, the Order was a game far more important to this industry than many of us understood at the time. Developer Ready at Dawn was among the pioneers of modern physically based materials rendering, and its work in this space, along with Crytek, Guerrilla Games, and Don't Nod, helped expedite the adoption of such techniques through its willingness to share and document its experiences during development. Removed from the hype of its day, The Order is an ultra-polished cinematic experience with visuals that feel remarkably modern and fresh even today. It was also a game which I covered for Digital Foundry prior to our shift to video, thus it never received a proper video analysis. So today I'd like to take you on a brief journey back through The Order 1886 and its astonishing presentation. We'll touch on the history of Ready at Dawn leading up to the game, explore the game and its visuals itself, and at the end, we'll even check out The Order running at 60 frames per second on PlayStation 5, including a mode in which the cinematic black bars have been removed. So with that in mind, let's begin. Formed in 2003, Ready at Dawn got its start in the portable world, working on Sony's soon-to-be-announced PlayStation Portable. Their first game, Daxter, was designed as a companion piece to the popular Jak and Daxter series on PlayStation 2. Given the constraints of the hardware, Daxter is a remarkable achievement that was widely recognized for its ability to translate a PS2-like experience to a portable machine. The relationship with Sony continued, with two original God of War games for the PSP, both of which delivered an experience that feels impressively familiar to fans of those PS2 games, while cementing the studio as a technical powerhouse. In the wake of its success then, Ready at Dawn was given the chance to develop its own original IP. And thus, even before the announcement of PlayStation 4, Ready at Dawn started its journey in building The Order 1886. The game was first announced on June 11, 2013 during the Sony E3 media briefing via this trailer, which revealed the setting of an alternate history London featuring a dazzling array of fantasy industrial equipment and monsters. Nearly 2 years later, in February of 2015, The Order 1886 arrived on store shelves and was promptly met with moderate scores and discussions centered around its short length, perceived limited interactivity, and its lack of replayability. Despite this, the game has gained its fair share of fans, and for good reason. It's an atmospheric, moody game with surprisingly solid gameplay and a compelling narrative. But what's perhaps most impressive is its place as a technical showcase of the PlayStation 4. The journey to this point must have been challenging, and the team needed to build an entirely new engine along with the tools that go with it to produce this game. The result is a presentation that remains as astonishing today as it was in 2015. At its core, this visual signature is defined by a focus on a soft filmic presentation. Great attention was poured into minimizing aliasing while using a large suite of cinematic visual effects to further its goal. It almost gives the impression of watching a film rather than playing an interactive game. Part of this stems from their approach to anti-aliasing. The Order uses 4x EQAA, or Enhanced Quality Anti-Aliasing. This is a special version of MSAA available on AMD GPUs, which increases the number of coverage samples without altering color and depth samples to improve performance. The clarity of its image, I think, speaks for itself. But MSAA does not solve in-surface or shader aliasing, which is why they use a custom resolve shader combined with temporal anti-aliasing, or TAA. The game is then presented at 1920 by 800, using letterboxing to improve performance. This resolution choice, however, produces a pixel grid aligned result without upscale blur when played on a 1080p display, which is why I believe they went with this over, say, 900p at full screen. This also scales evenly to 4K, so it looks great on a modern display.
See what's in there.
But of course, the Order 1886 is so much more than just image quality. There are three distinct elements which I feel define the visual quality of the Order 1886, which I'd like to discuss here today. Firstly, its reliance on plausible, physically based materials. Secondly, its expert use of light and shadow. And lastly, its filmic post-processing pipeline. So let's begin with the materials. One of its defining characteristics is the depiction of digital actors and the materials used to build this world. Physically based rendering forms the basis of modern real-time graphics and describes the modeling of light behavior across a surface, including reflection, diffusion, and metallic properties, among others. Ready at Dawn first presented its own take on building a next-generation materials pipeline at SIGGRAPH 2013, before the Order 1886 had shipped, or for that matter, the PlayStation 4. Now, keep in mind that very few AAA class games shipped with physically based rendering in 2013. The first was Don't Nod's Remember Me. Another was Crytek's Rise, Son of Rome. And lastly, there was Guerrilla Games' Killzone Shadowfall. So while the Order 1886 was not the first game to utilize such technology, the studio was already sharing its approach to this problem during this early period. Their openness up through and even after development served as a strong foundation from which other developers could build. Sharing their experiences in building their new materials pipeline is truly valuable information. So what makes this all so impressive, you ask? Well, firstly, this is one of the earliest examples of material scanning, where data from the real world was directly input through the scanning process, which then served as the basis for its materials. They basically created a library of realistic materials for use within the editor that could then be modified using composite layers. This allowed artists both freedom and agility in creating the game world. One of the examples they presented is this realistic copper material, which could serve as the base texture for something like a water spigot. The artist could then add composite layers to bring extra detail and grime to the surface, including rust. This collection of realistic materials and rapid iteration via composite layers seems to be central to their design that allowed the art team to create so many beautiful results. If you stop and look closely at any object within the world, you'll be treated to their fine craftsmanship throughout. Given the time period of its setting and the lack of high-intensity electric lighting, the quality here plays a tremendous role in grounding the experience, creating something that just looks realistic to the eye. There's these sequences when you first gain access to a new weapon or item where you're allowed to manipulate it in full 3D, and these moments I think really help you appreciate the intricate detail and realism on display. At the time of its release, there were precious few other games that could hope to compete with this aspect of its rendering. The material system very specifically enables this game to appear next generation to the eye. It felt like a gigantic leap over what we had seen during, say, the PlayStation 3 era. Now granted, the world isn't especially large and the game is very linear in its design, but what's here feels so convincing. You can easily believe that there's a much larger world beyond the constraints of the game, and a lot of this comes down to their expert wielding of next generation physically based materials. But of course, it's the lighting that helps tie everything else together to create a believable scene, and this is another area where I feel the Order excels. Specifically, it relies heavily on pre-calculated lighting to produce its global illumination, and the results can be jaw-dropping. Light floods across the scene exhibiting realistic bounce lighting and ambient glow. Natural shadows and specular highlights alike work in tandem to enhance the overall depth of each scene. To the eye, it just looks right. The question is then, how did they pull this off? Well, this is another topic that was covered in their 2015 SIGGRAPH presentation. Their goal with the game was to utilize bake GI to capture both diffuse and specular illumination in their bake. The solution to this problem then is spherical Gaussians. So what the heck is that, you ask? It sounds like a math term, and that's because it is. It's a Gaussian function defined on the surface of a sphere. But really, you don't need to understand the actual math or what it all means to know that such mathematical formulas are used in rendering to produce a variety of results, and all of these things need to be evaluated when determining the best results for your project. Ready at Dawn, of course, tested a wide range of possible solutions, and determined that spherical Gaussians could provide the best results for them versus just a cube map, spherical harmonics, or anything else given their project. That's basically how this game handles diffuse specular then, that is, the reflections visible across rougher materials like wood, stone, and the like, rather than the shiny stuff like metal or mirrors. So when light pours into a scene, you'll see that light reflected more subtly across its surface basically. This example from their presentation shows some of the benefits. Going back and forth between the two shots, note how using spherical Gaussians results in specular highlights across various surfaces that were otherwise absent. This applies to the more subtle shadows as well. You can see this here in this outdoor scene as well. Note this subtle specularity reflected across this iron beam. This is basically light from the sky reflecting in a diffuse fashion across the metal structure. This is extremely important for capturing the behavior of realistic lighting. Because obviously the goal here is to create something that's realistic, or at least close to something like path tracing, which is obviously far more expensive and not feasible on the PlayStation 4. Baking it out helps make it possible. Now for the more reflective surfaces, the game still leans heavily on cubic environment maps or cube maps, and I think it was a smart choice in this case. You see, in 2015 and even today really, games started to really lean heavily on dynamic solutions such as screen space reflections, but SSR has plenty of drawbacks. When parts of the image are occluded from view, for instance, you'll see those reflections sort of popped in and out of existence. It's very distracting. Low-resolution cube maps are often combined with SSR, but they don't usually match the scene. So in using them with this game, it seems like Ready at Dawn uses a ton of hand-placed cube maps of relatively high resolution that do a decent job of capturing the look of the scene across shiny materials. The cube maps all seem to be placed to align with the scenery, so that when you're actually moving around, it does seem to reflect the scenery correctly. Of course, the limitation here is that dynamic objects are not reflected, which means if you find a mirror, yeah, you're not going to reflect in it. But hey, maybe the twist is that Galahad is a vampire, like those that they find later in the game. Now this is all just sort of touching on the surface, and I'm not even getting into things like shadows, but the point is when you combine these techniques, the result is beautiful. Now obviously their solution to lighting wouldn't be viable in a game with a dynamic time of day or swiftly changing lighting conditions, but for a cinematic experience like this with a fixed time of day, it's perfect. And we'd see these techniques used again in the future in games such as Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us Part 2. Then of course this is the third point, the filmic effects. Now these can be a little controversial, but I do think it was a huge part of the visual design of the Order 1886, and taking it away would change the overall art direction of the game. Because really, they poured a lot of work into simulating the way a camera lens might view the action. That much is clear. There's bokeh depth of field, of course, which is beautiful. There's the film grain, there's the bloom simulation, advanced lens flares, tone mapping, and per pixel motion blur, just to name a few. Yeah, these things are commonplace today, of course, but the specific use of these features in the Order really demonstrates why they can be so important. A single frame from the game more closely resembles a shot from a film rather than an interactive game, which I suppose is what they were aiming for. In many ways, their focus on post-processing effects reminds me of Killzone 2 from 2009, though obviously with sort of a next-generation veneer. And I think that's the primary point behind everything we've discussed thus far, and why I think this game is so visually special. It's not just about the raw techniques in use, but how they're used, and that's really where the game shines. And really, it goes beyond the pure technical side. The Order is an impressive artistic accomplishment as well, from the sublime animation work, beautifully accentuated by the per pixel motion blur. This applies to both cutscenes, which look excellent.
This is Lakshmi Bai, the leader of the rebellion.
She is your confederate. Have you taken leave of your senses, man?
I might ask the same question.
If I didn't know you any better, I'd think you'd led me into a rebel ambush.
As I might fear an arrest.
We do not have time for this.
And gameplay, which feels very fluid. And this includes incidental objects scattered about the environment. Pots, pans, and other decorative objects all shatter and behave as you'd expect during a gunfight. It's more interactive than you might expect and really enhances the feel of combat. Then there's the sheer volume of creativity and detail poured into every weapon and gadget. So much care was poured into every inch of the game world. And it's a world of fantastic weapons and gadgets, a world of airships, werewolves, and vampires, and it all really resonates with me. Of course, given the technical limitations of the day, the Order 1886 is indeed a 30 frames per second game. Ready at Dawn did a fantastic job at adhering to this level of performance, of course. It's basically a locked 30 across the run of play, but as a 2015 release, it was never updated to support PS4 Pro, let alone PlayStation 5. That is, until now. Thanks to Illusion, the master of unlocking frame rates, the Order received a patch that could remove the 30 FPS cap, and thanks to recent discoveries regarding PS5s on older firmware, it's now possible to utilize this patch on this console. And just as it says on the tin, the 30 FPS cap is removed, allowing the game to run at a full 60 frames per second, just as you're seeing now. And honestly, I think it looks fantastic in motion. The motion blur shutter speed scales nicely to this higher frame rate, and yet the game still retains its cinematic look, while simultaneously providing a bump to overall fluidity.
Oh, God. They're slaughtering them. Ready?
Just get rid of this scum. Smoke grenades.
Right.
Smoke out! Alright, let's go.
Enemy down.
Of course, to utilize this on your own PlayStation 5, as I noted, you'll need to use older firmware, which means you can no longer connect to the network in this state. No multiplayer, no access to PSN, no downloads, nothing. This needs to be a fully offline system for it to work. Still, if you happen to have such a system, I think the results speak for themselves. Now, there is another limitation as well. Illusion uncovered an internal command variable with support for 2160p or 4K as a potential option. Unfortunately, the older SDK on which the Order is built does not support PS4 Pro or above, thus such resolutions are completely unusable. Perhaps it was a hint at a PC port, maybe just an internal PC version, who knows, but the option is there, just not usable. But there's more. Illusion also discovered a way to disable the game's black bars, resulting in a full 16:9 presentation. This required a drop to 900p unfortunately, as the game crashes otherwise, but these are the results, as you can see.
It's on the stairs.
However, as neat as this is, it's clear that the game was framed for an ultra-wide presentation, obviously, and using this option reduces the field of view and messes up some of the cinematic shots. Like here in this elevator scene, the camera is clearly cutting off the left and right side of the image in 16:9 mode. Of course, while fancy visuals are indeed a huge accomplishment, I must say that revisiting the game was somewhat eye-opening. I think the core mechanics and concepts driving the Order are genuinely fun and interesting. At the time of its release, open world games were exploding in popularity, so a game like this with its short runtime, lack of multiplayer, and extremely linear campaign definitely didn't sit well with folks, especially for full price. These days, however, you can buy a physical copy for $10 or a digital one for $20, which makes this kind of a non-issue. You're left with a tightly paced linear action game for the price of a movie. Which is kind of fitting really, since it's presented like one. In a sense, the Order feels like the final form of what those 90s FMV games wanted to achieve. It is of course far more interactive, as it's a proper third-person shooter with full 3D movement, but the goal is similar, to provide an experience that weaves seamlessly between cinematic scenes and gameplay. No section runs for too long, and what you do is constantly shifting. This isn't a game you'll necessarily keep returning to, but what's here is responsive, polished, and above all else, fun. Of course, the movie comparison also applies to the audio, which is something else I want to highlight. The game features a full 7.1 surround mix, and the attention to detail in its audio is extremely impressive. Here's some examples. So in this first scene, pay close attention to all the subtle sound effects, the jingling of Galahad's outfit, the crunch of the tiles breaking beneath his weight, the glass bottle hitting the floor, and everything else happening in the scene. Keep in mind that I had to capture this in stereo, but it's even better in surround sound. Or in combat, listen carefully to how each individual sound is mixed to create a convincing soundstage.
Damn it!
In many scenes, the music is dropped entirely, drawing attention to the game's sound mix.
Such indiscriminate slaughter. I've never seen its like before.
Of course, the game's soundtrack, composed by Jason Graves, is excellent in its own right and contributes greatly to the atmosphere. So yeah, it's a real treat for both the eyes and the ears. Now of course, following its release, Ready at Dawn did continue to support the game with some additional features, such as the robust photo mode, and this is really interesting because unlike most games, the Order allows you to fly the camera freely around the current area, where you can even break the visuals in some instances if you choose to do so. It's rare to have such freedom with a photo mode camera, but it's appreciated here as it allows you to get some shots that would be otherwise impossible. There are plenty of effects and adjustments to make as well, of course, but one of my favorites is the option to lock in your current settings and apply them to the in-game graphics as you play. Don't like the film grain, for instance? Well, you can disable it here or dial it in to suit your needs. This goes for most settings as well, and it's a smart addition. Seriously, this is one of the coolest features I've seen in a console game. It is effectively an in-game simplified reshade for this game on PlayStation 4. You can create some very cool results that push post-effects much further than they were intended. I recommend playing with the color grading option in particular. You can even adjust its intensity if you don't want to push it too far. So thus far I've had a lot of positive things to say about this game, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have its flaws. Firstly, the story feels incomplete. Just as things are starting to ramp up, the credits roll, and without a sequel, the ending can feel rather unsatisfying. It just feels like there's so much more to this world that we'll never get to explore. Furthermore, the precious few battles with Lycans aren't all that well implemented. You basically stand in place and attack them as they approach, then down them with a knife attack. It's used a few times throughout the game, and it's never really that satisfying. There's also one or two forced stealth sections, which I'd imagine some folks will not enjoy, but I found them engaging enough. It's also rather heavy on QTEs, but again, I think they're well implemented here and actually add to the cinematic experience. So from a modern perspective, more than 8 years after its release, this is the Order 1886. An ultra-polished, beautifully styled, technical masterpiece for PlayStation 4. An example of a potential series that didn't quite make it, but is well worth checking out today should you have the chance. Given its low price and those stunning visuals, even in 2023, I think it's well worth picking up and checking it out for yourself. But that's going to do it for this look back at the Order 1886. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to let us know. We'll see you next time.